It's all right if you don't understand, the professor smiled. But the boy kept his eyes on the chalkboard, as if staring into a space bent out of shape. And then, in that quiet classroom, his hand began to move, tracing something unseen, suspended in stillness, as if reaching into a part of the world no one had dared to name. Princeton is never loud, not even when autumn gold clings to the stone and the bells toll like distant memories through the chilled air. There is a hush that settles over this place, older than sound. Not silence, but reverence. A kind of listening. Fine Hall, the mathematics building, holds that hush more deeply than most. Its staircases echo with a deliberate slowness. The walls smell faintly of chalk, old paper, and varnished oak. Reminders of thoughts recorded before computers, before whiteboards, before the pace of the world quickened beyond recall. They say Einstein walked here, between lectures at the Institute. They say his coat flapped open in the wind, that he never remembered his socks, and that he once paused in front of a cracked window to whisper, "There is more geometry in a question than in an answer." Whether he said it or not, the story remains. And so it feels almost right, or perhaps fated, that a boy no one had noticed before should walk the same halls. Not a prodigy, not even a student, just a boy in a hand-me-down coat with threadbare elbows and a silent way of moving through space, as if he feared waking something sacred in the air. His name was Asa Collins. He was 13. He lived off campus in a maintenance shack behind the athletic field, where the pipes hissed all winter and the walls bore old posters of lacrosse teams from forgotten decades. His father, Mr. Collins, had worked nights for nearly 20 years, sweeping floors, polishing brass, and fixing whatever time had cracked. They spoke little. Asa was not the sort of child who filled silences, and Mr. Collins, having buried a wife long ago and a dream not long after, had learned to live inside the margins of his own breath. But Asa had a way of lingering, not quite following, not quite straying, like a moon that kept orbit without needing to be tethered. Each night while his father worked, Asa would sit in the back of room 204, a lecture hall half the size of a chapel, with blackboards that stretched across 3 walls and smelled of limestone dust. No one ever questioned the boy's presence. Perhaps they assumed he was a faculty child. Perhaps they thought he was part of the building. Asa never wrote down notes. He didn't speak, but his eyes stayed open and still, tracking each curve of chalk like someone tracing the movement of stars. That night, Professor Grayson was in one of his moods, half playful, half dangerous, the kind of mood that makes mathematicians say things they later regret or later remember for the rest of their lives. He stood before the board, drawing a neat Cartesian grid, the x-axis, the y-axis, a perfect circle centered at the origin. It was nothing special, the sort of thing first-year students see and forget. But Grayson didn't see shapes. He saw boundaries. "We've been trained to think in cages," he said, tapping the center of the circle. "Everything measured, everything defined. But what if—" And here he paused. "What if the structure itself is the problem?" Someone raised a hand. "Professor, are you suggesting we abandon coordinates?" Grayson gave a dry smile. "I'm suggesting that the universe doesn't owe us clarity. And maybe, just maybe, there's geometry beyond our maps." Laughter, some polite, some dismissive. He turned back to the board, drew 2 spirals, intersecting, then diverging. "If anyone here can draw a shape without reliance on the Cartesian grid, no axes, no anchor, I'll personally submit it to foundations of geometry." Again more laughter, and then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, his gaze drifted to the corner. "Asa," he said gently. It's all right if you don't understand. But the boy didn't blink. Instead, Asa stood. He walked to the front of the room, slow, as if every step required permission from the air itself. He didn't glance at the professor. He didn't ask for chalk. He lifted his hand. At first, no one knew what he was doing. His palm hovered above the blackboard, not touching, and began to move. A motion curved, then folded, then reversed, not drawing, not mimicking, just sensing. The room stilled. Asa's hand floated through space as if reading invisible currents. His fingers curled and uncurled, tracking something not visible, not quantifiable, but undeniably intentional. His movement had rhythm, but not repetition. A structure that felt organic, like the patterns of wind sweeping over grass, or the spirals that form inside shells. The students didn't speak, but some began to shift in their seats. One reached for their phone to record, and then stopped, as if it would break the spell. Grayson didn't move. He'd taught for 30 years. He'd written on topology, projective geometry, and the limits of Hilbert space. But nothing he had studied, no theorem, no proof, moved like this boy's hand. It wasn't showmanship. It wasn't genius in the traditional sense. It was something quieter, older. A shape of thought no longer trying to explain itself. When Asa stopped, he lowered his hand, blinked once, and walked back to his seat. He sat down without a word. And the room, still suspended, slowly remembered how to breathe. Later that night, long after the hall had emptied, Grayson remained. He stood before the same board, erasing the chalk with long, deliberate strokes. The circle was last. He reached toward its center and paused. He stared at it, hand hovering, just as Asa's had. And for the first time in years, after decades of calculation, publication, and debate, he felt the smallest tremor of doubt. Not fear, not failure, but doubt, the sacred kind. The kind that opens new rooms inside the mind. In the place where Einstein once walked, a janitor's boy had reached through space, not with knowledge, not with proof, but with a hand searching for a shape that hadn't yet been named. No one understood why the boy drew a circle without a center, but Asa had never believed a circle needed one in the first place. The room had been empty for hours. Most of Princeton slept behind old brick walls and heavy curtains. Students curled under blankets in dormitories older than the states themselves. The last cafe light had flickered out. Somewhere across campus, a radiator clicked softly, the building breathing in iron. But in Fine Hall, room 204 still held the faint ghost of chalk dust and thinking. Asa stood before the blackboard, alone. His father was downstairs, checking boiler valves. The building had been locked for the night, but Asa had a key, not to the door, but to the silence. He didn't turn on the lights. The moon was enough. It spilled through the high windows in soft rectangles, illuminating just enough of the board to see, or perhaps to feel. He reached into the tray and picked up a stick of white chalk. Not fresh. Slightly cracked. It fit his fingers like something familiar. He didn't start with a point. He didn't draw a center. Instead, he pressed the chalk gently against the board and moved it in a slow, spiraling motion. Not uniform, not perfect, but deliberate. A coil that tilted in space. Then another inside it, slightly skewed. Then a third, pulled just a little off axis. The shape grew, not outward, but inward. A curve that remembered something. He stepped back. There were no labels, no axes, no symmetry. But there was movement, not just in the drawing, but in the act itself. A living geometry. A shape that wasn't about being seen, but about being felt. Asa had always drawn this way, even before he had words for it, even before Princeton. Back when he lived with his mother in the mobile home in Elk Ridge, before the fire, before everything collapsed into one long winter. He remembered tracing shapes in the frost on the window pane. His mother would watch, brow furrowed, trying to understand. But Asa wasn't drawing for her, or for anyone. He was drawing to make sense of the world. And the world never gave him straight lines. That night, as he stood looking at the coils on the board, he didn't notice someone had entered the room. Bee stood at the door. She hadn't meant to be there. She'd left her thermos in the lecture hall earlier and returned quietly, expecting the room to be dark. But it wasn't empty. And what she saw, in the quiet, made her stay. She didn't speak. Not at first. She just watched him. This boy who didn't speak, didn't belong, didn't ask, and yet stood at the center of a space he had remade. When Asa finally noticed her, he didn't flinch. He just looked at her. Calm, direct, not curious, not embarrassed, just present. Bee stepped forward, careful not to step on the edge of the moonlight. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. Asa looked back at the board, then at his hand, still holding the chalk. "I'm trying not to choose a direction," he said. His voice surprised her. Not because it was strange, but because it wasn't. It was soft, low, without strain. Like he spoke only when a thing needed to be said, and no sooner. "What do you mean?" Bee asked. "If I draw a line," Asa said, "I have to choose a beginning, a place to come from, but the shapes I see, they don't come from anywhere." Bee looked at the board again. 3 coils, no center, no axis. It didn't look like geometry, not the kind she'd been taught, but it didn't look like art either. It was something else, something between. Back in her dorm that night, Bee couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the drawing. The boy. The way he moved his hand through the air like he was reading space instead of commanding it. She pulled out her sketch pad, something she hadn't done since switching her major from architecture to theoretical math, and tried to redraw what she'd seen. But she couldn't. Not the shape. Only the feeling. It bothered her more than she expected. The next morning, Bee met with her boyfriend, Jonas Venn, a doctoral candidate in applied mathematics. She showed him the rough drawing. "It's from the janitor's kid," she said, almost defensively. Jonas squinted. "You mean that quiet kid who sits in the back sometimes?" "Yeah." He looked at it again. "It's not anything, Bee. Just some spirals. A kid doodling." But she shook her head. "It's not random," she said. "The spacing, the tilt. There's a pattern, but it's not symmetrical. It's like, it's organized, but not from a fixed point." Jonas shrugged. "There's no system without a fixed point. Maybe he's trying to show something that doesn't need one." Jonas didn't say anything, but later that day, out of idle curiosity, he opened up a modeling software he sometimes used for non-linear systems. He tried to replicate the drawing, not perfectly, but based on the memory Bee had described. The moment he input the 3rd coil, something strange happened. The software attempted to assign rotational symmetry and failed. Then it reprocessed the shape as a field, a continuous field. The math engine threw an error, not because it couldn't compute, but because it couldn't classify. Jonas frowned. He added depth, tilted the figure in 3D space, and watched. The model behaved like a self-stabilizing system, not unlike the earliest simulations of emergent quantum fields. But it didn't collapse. It didn't decay. It rotated, not around an axis, but around itself, a closed, non-Euclidean envelope. He sat back and stared. That evening, Jonas walked to Fine Hall. He waited until the lecture was over, then found Asa outside the building, sitting on the low stone ledge near the bike racks. The boy didn't look up. "You made something," Jonas said. Asa looked at him. Jonas took out a tablet and showed the model. "This is what your drawing does when I put it in a system." Asa nodded. Jonas studied him for a moment. "Where did you learn to do that?" "I didn't," Asa said. "Then how?" "I just don't like lines." Jonas blinked. Asa clarified slowly, as if unwrapping something fragile. "Lines always end. They point. They leave things behind. But the shapes I see, they hold. They wrap. They don't leave." There was a long pause, the kind that doesn't break a moment, but deepens it. Finally, Jonas asked, "Do you want to show this to someone?" Asa shook his head. "Why not?" "Because they'll ask me to explain." "You can try." Asa looked away. "When I explain, it becomes a line." That night, Jonas told Bea, "He's not just guessing. He's seeing something." And she said quietly, "I think he always has." Across campus, in a darkened classroom, the chalk drawing still remained. 3 coils, no center, no grid, only a field of movement, as if space itself had paused and let a child speak first. No one understood why the boy drew a circle without a center. But Asa had never believed a circle needed one in the first place. "But if there are no axes," she asked, "how can you measure anything?" "Who said everything has to be measured?" the boy replied. Bea stood at the window of the student commons, cradling a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, the campus looked like it had been carved from amber. Morning sun on stone, leaves unmoving in the still air. But her thoughts didn't match the calm. She kept turning it over in her mind. The coils, the absence of symmetry, the field Jonas had simulated. It wasn't just strange. It was unsettling. Like opening a familiar door and finding an entirely different room. She had studied topology. She had read Mandelbrot and Gödel, played with strange attractors and fractals in her sophomore year. But this was different. It wasn't wild. It wasn't chaotic. It was intentional. But without rules she could recognize. And that made her feel small, in a way she hadn't felt in years. Jonas didn't say much that day. He sat in his lab, the monitor dimmed, fingers idle on the keyboard. He replayed the model Asa had inspired, tilting it, stretching it, letting the simulation flow. It never stabilized in the traditional sense, but it never broke either. The form had no center, no axis of rotation, no repeating pattern, and yet the spacing between each curve obeyed a ratio. Irregular, yes, but not random. It oscillated around a strange average, like a frequency that could not be heard, only seen in motion. At one point, Jonas fed it into a quantum field simulator as a lark. The software, designed to test hypothetical topologies, identified the shape as non-classifiable. Then it tried to treat it as a potential energy well, and it held. That shouldn't have been possible. Jonas leaned back in his chair. He was not religious, but something about the shape felt older than math. As if it had been waiting for someone to remember it. Later that week, Bea and Jonas sat in a quiet corner of the campus cafeteria. She had drawn the shape again, this time freehand on a napkin. She slid it across to him. "This is how he thinks." Jonas nodded. "It's not a thought. It's a space." That night, they found Asa again. He was in the same classroom, room 204, drawing with chalk in the low light, just as he always did. No one had given him permission. No one had asked him to stop. He looked up when they entered, then looked away again, returning to the board. Jonas approached slowly. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No," Asa said. B smiled gently. "Then can we ask questions?" Asa shrugged. That wasn't a no. She stepped closer, looking at the shapes, now more complex than before. No longer just coils. Some moved in and out of each other like threads folded into fabric. "Are these supposed to intersect?" she asked. "They never do," Asa said. "They look like they do." "They don't." He stepped back, pointing. "They wrap, like breath wrapping around sound. They move closer, but never cut." Jonas raised an eyebrow. "Like strands in a field?" Asa nodded. "But if they don't intersect," B asked, "how do they build anything?" Asa thought for a long moment, then said, "They don't build. They hold." The word echoed more than expected. Hold. A geometry of support, not force. A space made not by structure, but by presence. Asa stepped aside and let them look. Really look. B traced the lines in the air, careful not to touch. "You don't use triangles," she murmured. "They break," Asa said. "Rectangles? They trap. And straight lines?" Asa hesitated, then whispered, "They lie." Jonas said nothing for a long time. Finally, he asked, "What do you mean they lie?" Asa looked down at his shoes, scuffed, too large, clearly not new. "A straight line tells you something ends here and starts there," he said. "It says space is like string. Pull it, and it tightens. But it's not." He looked up. Space doesn't tighten. It folds. It forgets. It curves even when we can't see it. And if you try to draw it straight, it pushes back. Silence. Not heavy, just full. Jonas sat down on the floor. So did B. They watched Asa as he continued his drawing, line by patient line. At some point, Grayson passed by. He paused at the door, didn't enter, just stood there, listening to the chalk move. Then quietly turned away. He would not admit it aloud, not yet, but the boy had begun to undo something in him. Not his knowledge, but his certainty. The next morning, Jonas emailed one of his old mentors, a professor at Caltech working on topological invariance in quantum spaces. He didn't send the drawing, just a question. "Is it possible to model a spatial system that maintains coherence without fixed axes, using non-intersecting, oscillating curves that remain in asymptotic proximity without converging?" The professor replied, "Not unless you abandon Hilbert space, and physics, and the idea of measurable time." Jonas stared at the reply, and smiled. Back in room 204, Asa erased the board. Not because he was finished, but because the board was never meant to keep the drawing, only to let it happen. "If there are no axes, how can you measure anything?" she asked. "Who said everything has to be measured?" the boy replied. And in that moment, the space without straight lines became not a puzzle, but a promise. Asa stopped coming to the lecture room. The board had been wiped clean, the door locked, and the professor said, "Let's stop encouraging this nonsense." For 2 nights, Asa didn't show up. Room 204 stayed dark. The chalk tray sat untouched. There were no strange coils on the board, no quiet footsteps in the hall before midnight. B noticed first, then Jonas. They asked around, casually at first. Nobody had seen Mr. Collins either. No mop bucket in the stairwell, no rattle of keys during late rounds. A janitor could go unnoticed for weeks. But once someone starts listening for their absence, the silence grows louder. Jonas stopped by facilities. A woman at the desk squinted at her screen. Collins, Howard, still assigned to Fine Hall. No reported absence. Can I leave a note for him? She shrugged. You can try. Jonas left a small envelope. It was never picked up. On the third night, Jonas and Bee returned to room 204. The door was locked. Not just closed, locked with a chain from the inside and a new sign. Faculty access only. Jonas tried his key card. Nothing. He checked the hallway. No one around. Bee stepped back, squinting through the narrow glass slit in the door. The board had been cleaned, completely. Not a speck of chalk remained, not a smudge. The tray had been emptied, the chairs reset. It didn't look like a classroom. It looked like a place that had been cleared of memory. They found Grayson the next morning in the faculty lounge, pouring black coffee into a chipped white mug. Bee didn't wait. Why is room 204 locked? Grayson didn't look up. I asked them to secure it. Why? Because this is a university, he said flatly. Not a playground. Jonas stepped in. He wasn't disrupting anyone. Grayson finally turned to face them. His eyes were sharp, not angry, but focused, like someone trying very hard to hold on to a version of reality that had begun to bend. He was drawing nonsense on the board. You two encouraged it. The other students started whispering about it. It became a distraction. Bee's voice wavered. You told him he didn't need to understand, that it was all right. That was before, Grayson said, sipping his coffee. Before I realized what it was doing to the room. To the room? To the rules, he snapped, then paused. Do you know what I spent 40 years studying? Do you know how many journals rejected my early work because it wasn't provable enough? Because I dared to imply that topology had emotional shape? He looked down at his mug. And now a boy with no training walks in, waves his hand, and everyone stares like it's magic. It wasn't magic, Jonas said quietly. Grayson didn't reply. He just walked away. Asa didn't return to campus for a week. He stayed home, if that's what the trailer behind the field house could be called, scribbling in silence while his father worked double shifts to make up for his sudden reassignment. The new cleaning schedule moved Mr. Collins to the engineering building. No more Fine Hall, no more room 204, no more blackboard. Asa didn't complain. He didn't speak about it at all. But he began drawing smaller, not on the board, but on paper. Page after page of spirals, folds, loops, fields, always in pencil. Always alone. One night, his father came home late. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Asa hunched over the table, the small lamp casting long shadows over the boy's hands. Still drawing? Asa nodded. Don't they have computers for that now? Asa shrugged. Mr. Collins stepped inside, boots heavy on the floor. He pulled off his cap, ran a hand over his thinning hair. You know, sometimes people don't want to see something new. Not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't fit in the drawer where they keep their truth. Asa didn't look up. He just said, I didn't draw it for them. That weekend, Jonas knocked on their door. It was the first time Asa had seen anyone from campus since the lab was locked. He opened the door a few inches. Jonas held up a folder, not thick, but dense, filled with printed simulations, hand-drawn annotations, and pages from a physics thesis Jonas had written months ago. before he knew any of this mattered. "I want to show you something," Jonas said. Asa opened the door wider. Inside, Jonas laid out the pages like a puzzle. Coils, vectors, 3D models printed in grayscale, simulated fields. One image caught Asa's attention, a series of arcs rotating around nothing. "Your drawings, they're not just curves," Jonas said. "They simulate a field with density, elasticity, potential. When I feed them into quantum systems, they behave like space. Not like space inside a grid, but space itself." Asa stared at it. "I didn't know that," he said. Jonas smiled. "I know. That's why it matters." That night, Asa didn't sleep. He stayed at the table until sunrise, a stack of graph paper at his side, sketching something he hadn't tried before. A triple helix, but not a braid. 3 coils circling each other, never touching, always shifting, always holding shape. A geometry without origin. A system without reference. A structure without obedience. And in the margin of the last page, in the smallest, softest handwriting, "I don't want to be right. I want to see what holds." And so the boy returned to his world, not through a door, but through a drawing, not welcomed but undeterred. The lab had been locked, the board erased. But some shapes, once seen, cannot be unseen. A graduate student lingered after a lecture, just long enough to notice the strange drawing left on the table, and couldn't look away. The table was empty. At least, it appeared so at first. The lecture had ended nearly 20 minutes earlier. Most of the students had filed out, murmuring equations under their breath, the smell of dry erase markers still hanging in the air. Jonas Venn had forgotten his notebook. That's all. He had come back for it. Nothing more. But when he stepped into the seminar room and crossed toward the second row, the table where he always sat, half by habit, half by boredom, he saw a folded sheet of paper lying on the edge. Not his. Unlabeled. Forgotten. He almost didn't open it. But something about the way it was folded, not sloppily but carefully like a kept secret, made him pause. He reached for it and opened it. Inside was a drawing. Not in ink. Pencil. Light strokes. Spiraling. 3 loops nested like orbits, but not round. Not geometric. They wove into one another, but never touched. Each curve bent slightly differently, as if responding to a force that wasn't there. Jonas sat down. He stared. At first, he tried to name what he was seeing. Toroids? No. There was no rotation. Braids? No. There was no weaving. He turned the page sideways, then upside down. It didn't matter. The structure didn't depend on orientation. There were no coordinates, no reference marks, just shape. Shape that held itself. His breath slowed. He didn't know why it made him feel quiet, but it did. He brought the paper back to his dorm, scanned it, ran it through 3 modeling programs, one he'd written himself, just to see what would happen. Each program tried to assign parameters, radius, curvature, centroid. Each failed. Then something curious happened. When he fed the scanned drawing into a topological modeler, the software interpreted it not as a 2D sketch, but as a field map, one that hinted at a 3-dimensional fold, as if the shape wasn't static, as if it moved through space, slowly, gently, without beginning or end. He tilted the model on his screen, breath held. It shimmered, not visually, but mathematically. Jonas leaned forward and whispered to no one. "What are you?" The next day, B found him sitting in the lab, eyes fixed on the monitor. "You didn't come to class," she said. "I found something." She looked at the screen, recognized the shape instantly. "You kept it?" "I couldn't not." She sat beside him. "That's from Asa." "I know." B looked at him, half smiling. "And now you're obsessed." "Not obsessed, just unwilling to forget." She reached into her bag and pulled out a second sheet, one Asa had left behind in the Commons the week before. "Here," she said. "Another one." Jonas laid it beside the first. Together, the two drawings began to speak, not in language, but in relationship. The spacing between the curves, the mirrored shifts, the way one spiral seemed to complete the pause of the other. He exhaled. Slowly. "These aren't shapes," he said. "No. They're conversations." That night, Jonas waited. He sat on the low stone wall outside the faculty parking lot, just beneath the lamps that always flickered at 11:20 p.m. Asa arrived, coat sleeves too long, shoes slightly untied. He didn't flinch when he saw Jonas. He just stopped. Waited. Jonas stood. "Did you mean to leave that drawing?" Asa looked at the ground. "No." Jonas nodded. "I'm glad you did." A long silence. Then Asa asked, "Did it bother you?" "No. Most people get uncomfortable." Jonas smiled gently. "I'm not most people." They sat together on the wall. Nothing dramatic, no music. Just two figures under a flickering light, staring out into the quiet of Princeton at night. Jonas spoke first. "I ran your drawing through a model. It didn't break, but it didn't classify either." Asa looked up. "That's good." Jonas tilted his head. "Why?" "Because it means it's still alive." That made Jonas laugh. But it wasn't mocking. It was something else. Something like relief. In the days that followed, they met again. Jonas started bringing chalk. Asa started trusting him. Not with everything, but enough. He showed him sketches, ideas, things he'd never explained to anyone else. "Why do you never draw straight lines?" Jonas asked once. Asa didn't answer right away, then, "Because straight lines try to solve." "And that's bad?" "No," Asa said. "But I'm not trying to solve. I'm trying to listen." B began to call it the field language. Not a theory, not a system, but a way of describing the unspoken structure of space, the tendency of things to bend toward rest, not resolution. Jonas wrote it down, in pencil, carefully. He wasn't building a paper, he was keeping a record. Grayson heard the rumors. He pretended he didn't. He still locked room 204, still drank his coffee in silence. But one afternoon he paused beside B in the hallway and said, low and slow, "If you keep feeding the myth, it will grow teeth." B looked at him without blinking. "Or wings." And across campus, in a small maintenance flat with a cracked window and a flickering lamp, Asa drew something new. Not coils, not loops, but a single curve that bent so slowly it seemed still, and then, just before closing, turned inward on itself. He drew it again, and again, and again, until the page turned gray. Then he drew it once more, lightly, barely touching the pencil to the paper. And in the white space between the lines, he saw something begin. A graduate student stayed a few seconds longer than he needed to. That was all. Just enough to see what someone else had almost forgotten to leave behind. And once you see it, truly see it, you cannot look away. Asa, if you can write down what you see, just enough for someone else to follow, I'll take you to an open math conference. Where no one will laugh. Where no one will ask you to explain before they've listened. It started with a post-it note. Not from Asa, from Jonas. He left it on the corner of the table where Asa always sat in the commons, far from the center, near the old radiator that hissed even when it wasn't cold. The note read, "Would you come to Boston? It's not far. I'll be there either way, but I'd rather not go alone." There was no signature, but Asa knew who had written it. Jonas had been accepted to present a short demo at the New England Open Math Conference, a gathering held twice a year, not formally affiliated with any university, but frequented by professors, independent researchers, retired mathematicians, and the occasional brilliant dropout. The theme this year was Structure Without Symmetry. Jonas hadn't submitted a paper. He submitted a question. Can a spatial model hold coherence without fixed axes and still admit field properties? They accepted it. But he knew the real spark hadn't come from his thesis. It had come from a boy drawing on the edge of a table. He found Asa behind Fine Hall, sitting cross-legged near a stack of crates used for landscaping supplies. Asa was drawing again, not in a notebook, on the concrete, with a piece of chalk he'd found broken in two. The shape was soft, elongated. Like a loop trying not to be a loop. Jonas waited until Asa looked up. "I'm going to Boston next week," Jonas said. "There's a math gathering. Informal. No grades, no gatekeepers." Asa didn't say anything. "But," Jonas added, "they listen. Really listen. Even when they don't understand." He paused. "If you're willing to put a few of your shapes into words, just enough for someone to try following the path, I'll bring you, not as a student, not as a case study, just as you." Asa's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do I have to talk?" "No." "Do I have to prove anything?" "No." Asa returned to his drawing. After a long pause, he said, "I'll try to write." It took 3 nights. Asa borrowed a stack of old graph paper from Jonas and sat for hours in the commons, unnoticed as usual. He didn't write sentences, not at first. Just arrows, marks, notes like, "This turns in," or "Hold here, not break." Symbols he half-invented, half-stole from musical notation and architectural diagrams. B looked at one page and whispered, "He doesn't write math. He writes movement." Jonas agreed. It's choreography for something invisible. The trip to Boston was quiet. Asa had never been more than 2 towns outside Princeton. He didn't look out the window much on the train. He held a folder on his lap, filled with sketches and barely decipherable notes. At one point he asked Jonas softly, "Do they laugh?" Jonas shook his head. "They may not get it, but they'll know when to be quiet." Asa nodded once and went still again. The conference was held in an old school building, now repurposed as a learning center for adult education. The chalkboards had cracks. The chairs squeaked. But the air was full of that rarest substance in academia, curiosity without performance. Jonas presented his field coherence model with just a whiteboard marker and 5 sketches. A few people nodded. One older professor asked if it had application in acoustic topology. Then Jonas paused and asked if he could invite someone up. Asa stood at the front of the room. His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't look scared, just barely contained. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began to draw. 3 loops, not perfect, not symmetrical, but purposeful. He added arrows, then pauses, then a note. Holds itself, not others. Someone near the back whispered, "That's not a diagram." It's a gesture. Another. That's not a model. That's a behavior. A third, older voice. It's how space would draw itself if it forgot we were watching. Asa didn't explain. He didn't ask for questions. He simply stepped back. And the room, made of scholars and skeptics and old thinkers with soft hands, didn't clap. They just watched. And for once, that was enough. Afterward, a woman in her 70s approached Jonas. She had once taught topology at Dartmouth, now long retired. She said quietly, "That boy's drawing. I dreamt something like it in 1986, but I was told it wasn't publishable." Jonas said, "He doesn't care about publishing." The woman smiled, eyes damp. "Maybe that's why it's true." That evening, in a quiet cafe by the train station, Jonas and Asa sat across from each other, a cup of tea growing cold between them. Jonas asked, "How did it feel?" Asa shrugged. "I didn't like the lights." Jonas chuckled. "Me neither." Asa added, "But it was okay, because no one asked me to explain before they looked." On the ride home, Asa slept, and in his sleep, his hand moved slightly, fingers curling, as if still drawing something just beyond the glass of the train window. "Asa, if you can write it down, I'll take you to a place where no one will laugh." And he did. And for the first time, Asa saw what it looked like when people didn't demand answers, but sat with questions long enough to see them become shapes. Asa didn't explain. He simply picked up a piece of chalk, and the room went silent. Not because they understood, but because they could feel something was speaking, and it wasn't made of words. It was the second day of the conference. The first session was dry, a talk on category theory that unraveled halfway through its own definitions. A few attendees snuck out for coffee. Others doodled in their notebooks, their pens moving faster than their minds. Asa sat quietly in the second row. Legs tucked beneath the chair, sketchbook on his lap, pencil unmoving. He didn't seem bored, just distant, as though the room hadn't earned his attention yet. Jonas, sitting beside him, noticed the stillness. "Asa," he whispered, "are you all right?" Asa didn't answer. He was watching the speaker's hands, not the slides, not the math, just the hands. They moved in straight lines. Later that afternoon, the small auditorium filled for what was advertised as a problem session. Open format. Unscripted. Professors, students, and curious minds gathered to share questions that still had no answers. A white-haired professor stepped forward. She carried no laptop, just a piece of folded paper. Her name was Dr. Miriam Cohen, retired from the Institute for Advanced Study. She looked like she'd seen every version of the same question and still chose to love it. She cleared her throat. "I've been studying nonlinear spatial structures for 40 years, she said, "and I've come here not to present, but to ask." A murmur of curiosity. She unfolded the paper. On it was a tangled diagram, a looped figure 8 overlaid with waveforms, vectors, and curvature arrows that defied symmetry. "I can't model this," she admitted. "It's neither a manifold nor a field. I've tried folding it into Hilbert space, but it resists. Always resists." She looked around the room. "Does anyone see it differently?" Silence. Then a hand, small, thin, raised near the aisle. Asa. The room turned. He didn't stand, just quietly walked to the front where the chalkboard stood blank. Dr. Cohen stepped aside. Asa took a breath, picked up a piece of chalk, and, without a word, began to draw. The first line was a curve, long, slow, deliberate. not a copy of Dr. Cohen's diagram. A response, then another, bending beneath the first, then a third, crossing, not intersecting, but acknowledging. He moved slowly. Each line waited for the next, as if in dialogue. Some shapes closed. Others remained open, invitations rather than conclusions. He never looked at the audience. He looked at the board, at the space between the lines. And something happened. The room quieted, not out of politeness, but because it felt like interrupting would be rude to the drawing. It was not art. It was not math. It was something between a language built from breath. When he finished, Asa stepped back. He placed the chalk gently in the tray, not dropped, not tossed. He didn't turn around. He simply returned to his seat. No words, no explanation. Dr. Cohen stood before the board, blinking slowly. Then she nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding, and said, "This isn't a proof, it's a listening." Afterward, people crowded Jonas. "Where's he from? How old is he? Does he publish?" Jonas answered softly, again and again, "He draws more than he speaks." And they nodded as if that somehow made sense. In a corner of the lobby, Bea sat with Asa. She placed her hand on his sketchbook. "You didn't even speak," she said. Asa shrugged. "I didn't need to." "Why not?" He looked at her, then at the board through the glass. They were finally quiet enough. That night, Asa stood alone at the edge of the river. The Charles flowed smooth and black beneath the moon. He took out a pencil, not to draw, but to move, over the air, over the water, over the reflection of the city in motion. He traced a shape that only he could feel. And for a moment, he smiled. Just a little. Asa didn't explain. He didn't need to. Because sometimes when a hand draws slowly enough and the room listens long enough, even silence becomes a sentence. "If a 13-year-old can do this," said one voice, "then what does that say about my PhD?" Another, "He's not drawing insight. He's just drawing." There is a moment in every gathering of minds when silence stops being reverent and becomes dangerous. It happened on the third day of the conference. After Asa's drawing, after the pause that followed, after the quiet praise from Dr. Cohen, the room began to shift, not aloud at first, but in glances, in postures, in conversations that began with, "He's clearly intuitive, but it's fascinating, sure, but not formal. He's a kid. We're not seriously..." The doubt did not come because Asa was wrong. It came because he might be right, and not one of them had seen it first. Jonas noticed the change. He watched it roll like a cloud through the hallway, from one pocket of conversation to the next. Some were genuinely puzzled. Others felt protective of their field, as if Asa had entered a cathedral with muddy shoes. One man, a professor from a West Coast institute, pulled Jonas aside and said, "It's charming what you're doing. But if we start treating visual intuition as evidence, what happens to rigor? What happens to proof?" Jonas asked calmly, "What happens if the proof doesn't come with words?" The man walked away. That evening, during a closed session, a challenge was issued, not official, but real. Dr. Vito Klein, a respected geometric physicist, presented a shape, one unsolved, one debated, a complex figure used in modeling quantum localization within uncertain boundary spaces, long thought to require intersecting vectors across a fixed 3D grid. The challenge: "If your boy's model holds," he said, not unkindly, "let's see if it can make sense of this." If he can render the underlying logic in any usable form, even just a mock field, I'll retract every word of doubt. A few chuckled. Some leaned forward. Jonas hesitated, but Asa stood. No one asked him to. He just rose, took the paper, sat down on the floor, and began to draw. There was no blackboard, just carpet. There was no chalk, just pencil and silence. Asa looked at the figure for a long time. He didn't speak. Then, instead of trying to replicate it, he did what he always did. He listened. His hand moved, not to copy, but to respond. He didn't draw the solution. He drew the conditions that would allow the shape to rest. A curve here, holding. A second, leaning into the void of the first. A third, sweeping gently around the hole, not enclosing, but stabilizing. He paused, then wrote in the corner, "This doesn't solve. It allows." Klein looked at it, then at Jonas, then said, "This is not how we answer physics." Jonas replied, "Maybe not, but it might be how physics answers us." Later, in the hallway, two doctoral students from MIT debated whether Asa's model was useful or aesthetic. One said, "He's just drawing feelings." The other said, "Yeah, but maybe that's what we've been missing." That night, Jonas sat with Asa on a bench near the Charles River. Asa had been quiet since the challenge. He hadn't eaten, hadn't drawn, just watched the water move. Finally, Jonas said, "You don't have to prove anything to them." Asa asked, "Then why did it feel like they wanted me to stop existing?" Jonas didn't answer, because the boy wasn't wrong. In the train station the next morning, a man approached Asa. He was older, carried a worn briefcase, wore a corduroy blazer with frayed cuffs. He didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "I saw your drawing, the one with 3 curves." Asa looked up. The man continued, "I spent 8 years trying to model a closed energy system using orthogonal fields. It never worked." He reached into his case, pulled out a folded paper, yellowed, faded, creased like a letter never sent. Asa opened it. It was familiar, not in structure, but in yearning. The man whispered, "Your shape didn't solve it, but it made me want to try again." Asa smiled, just a little, and gave the drawing back. If the boy is right, what does that say about the rest of us? Maybe that you forgot how to draw something without proving it first. Or maybe that he never needed your permission to begin. "I don't want to write a thesis," Asa said. "I just want to draw for those who were never allowed to look." The invitations came quickly. Emails, letters, 2 phone calls, first from a visiting professor in Zurich, then from a lab in Tokyo, then finally from a scholarship committee at Princeton itself. Full ride. All access. Advanced standing. They had seen his drawings. His conference appearance had spread faster than Jonas expected. A photo here, a quiet article there. Not mainstream, not viral, but to the right people, it was enough. The boy who drew space. Jonas brought the news to Asa one evening in early spring. They sat on a bench near the east side of the fine hall lawn, where the grass was beginning to show beneath the snow. Jonas had a folder in his lap. Inside, a typed letter with the Princeton crest. He handed it to Asa without speaking. Asa read it, once, then folded it closed, and handed it back. Jonas waited, then asked, "Do you understand what this means?" Asa nodded. "It means they saw me," he said. "Now they want me to fit." Jonas blinked. "Fit?" Asa looked out across the lawn. If I go, he said, they'll ask me to prove it, to formalize, to fix it into place. But that's not what the shapes are. Jonas said softly, they want to help you grow. No, Asa said. They want to grow me into something they can use. Bea joined them later that evening. She had heard the news. She smiled as she approached, but it faded when she saw Asa's face. You're not happy? Asa shook his head. I don't need a place in the system. I need space. To do what? Bea asked. To draw, he said. For who? Asa was quiet, then answered, for people who don't know they're allowed. A week later, Asa didn't show up at Fine Hall. Not at the Commons, not at the chalkboard. Jonas and Bea checked his home. A knock at the back of the maintenance trailer. Mr. Collins answered, eyes tired, shirt stained with oil. He's not here, he said. Left early this morning. Took his backpack. Said he was meeting someone. Who? The man shrugged. Said he was going to the place with the loud kids. Jonas and Bea looked at each other. The community center. They found him sitting on the floor of the after-school room, surrounded by children. One girl was nonverbal, fingers moving in the air. One boy wore headphones too large for his head. Two others were arguing about crayons. Asa sat on the floor between them, holding up a sheet of paper. He wasn't teaching. He wasn't speaking. He was drawing. Slow, wide arcs. Loops that never touched. Curves with space inside them like quiet between words. The children watched, then, one by one, began to draw too. None copied. None asked what it meant. They just joined the shape. Jonas knelt beside him. This is what you want to do? Asa didn't stop drawing. Yes. Bea stood behind him, arms folded. And the scholarship? Asa looked up. Let someone else take it. Are you sure? He nodded. It was never mine. I didn't earn it the way they think I did. I don't want to spend 10 years trying to translate something that wasn't meant for their language. Jonas said, You're walking away from an entire future. Asa replied, No, I'm drawing one. By summer, the center gave him a wall, not a classroom, just a wall, clean, white, high. They called it the Free Geometry Board. Children came after school, some neurodiverse, some from shelters, some who just liked the quiet. Asa brought chalk. No tests, no grades, no lectures, just curves, and listening, and the sound of pencils moving in uneven rhythm. Once, Bea sat in and asked him, What do you call this? Asa said, Not geometry, not art, just permission. That fall, a student from the education department visited. He watched in silence, then wrote an article, The Geometry of the Unspoken. It was read by 20 people, but one of them was Dr. Grayson. He read it twice, then drove across town. He stood at the back of the community center, leaning against the wall, arms folded. Asa saw him, said nothing, kept drawing. Dr. Grayson watched for 20 minutes, then turned to leave. But at the door, he stopped, took out a small notepad, and wrote, Maybe I was asking for proof before I'd earned the right to look. He left it on the bench. Asa found it later, didn't respond. But the next morning there was a second stool at the wall, just in case. I don't want to write a thesis, Asa said. I want to draw for the ones who were never given the language in the first place. And that's exactly what he did. On the wall of the Fairbridge Library, they hung a framed drawing of Asa's first spiral. Beneath it, someone carved, Not all of us walk in straight lines. A year passed, then another. Winters came and went in Princeton. The ivy browned, the bricks cracked, the river froze, then thawed again. The buildings didn't change, but something softer did. The whisper of Asa's name still drifted through Fine Hall, not loudly, not often, but like wind through old windows. He never returned to the lecture rooms, but the faculty began to. Not to teach, to watch, to sit, sometimes at the back of the community center, notebooks open but unused, as Asa and the children filled the board with curves and pauses and open spaces. They didn't call it math anymore. They called it something else. Practice, permission, listening. A museum asked for one of Asa's original drawings. He said no, but sent them a photocopy. Only if they promised to hang it without explanation. They agreed. The drawing sits today in a hallway between two galleries. Most people pass it. Some don't. A few stand still, long enough to remember something they never learned. At the Fair Bridge Library, where Asa's father once cleaned the baseboards with vinegar and rags, a librarian named Marta framed one of Asa's early chalk drawings from room 204. She found it folded behind an old radiator, yellowing but intact. She hung it quietly above a low shelf near the philosophy section, and under it, carved into the wood, "Not all of us walk in straight lines." No attribution, no plaque, just a shape, soft, looping, incomplete, like a breath still in motion. Asa kept drawing. Every week, same wall, same time. Some children stayed, some moved on. Some came back years later, older, holding their own sketchbooks. They didn't draw the same. That wasn't the point. The point was, they drew without asking first. B became a teacher. Jonas moved west to work with non-Euclidean simulation tools. They kept in touch. Every holiday, Asa would mail them a folded piece of paper. No note. Just a shape. A reminder. That language doesn't have to speak. One spring afternoon, Dr. Grayson returned to the wall. He was older now, thinner, carried a cane. He stood for a long time watching the children draw. Asa noticed, offered him a piece of chalk. The old man hesitated, then took it. His hand shook slightly, but he bent down and drew one curve, then another, then stopped. Asa didn't say anything, but placed a hand lightly on the chalkboard just below the drawing. Acknowledgement without correction. Grayson whispered, "I used to think math had to hold still to be true." Asa whispered back, "Maybe it just had to be held." That night, Grayson wrote an essay. It was never published, but he printed 10 copies. One went to Asa. The title, "The Geometry." We mocked. The last line read, "Some truths arrive not through logic, but through longing." On the 5th anniversary of the first drawing, a boy, no longer so small, stood alone by the board as the children cleaned up. He looked at the space, the chalk dust, the trails left behind by hundreds of hands. He didn't add anything. He didn't need to. He erased the board, gently, as if clearing a breath, and left the wall empty, not for forgetting, but for the next drawing to come. On the wall of the Fair Bridge Library, someone carved, "Not all of us walk in straight lines." And long after Asa stopped drawing, the space he left behind still moved, quietly, like something soft turning toward the light.